Hello everyone, Jason here for another deck tech video. Today we are going to be diving into the deck that I played in our Bloomburrow episode. This is Glarb, Calamity's Augur. Glarb is a 2/4 Frog Wizard Noble for 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue, and it has Death Touch and says you may look at the top card of your library at any time. It also says you may play lands and cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top of your library, and then you can tap Glarb to surveil 2. I really gravitated towards Glarb because, as many of you know, looking at the top card of my library is my favorite thing to do in this game. So my goal for this deck was just to get as many lands out onto the battlefield and then use that mana to play really big spells and get a huge advantage all in one turn and hopefully outvalue my opponents that way. Another thing that I did with this is I wanted to put a few frogs in here. I think I have 12 or 13 frogs in this deck. And every time I've played it, it actually gets a decent amount of frogs onto the battlefield, which is nice because I do like all the frogs that I have in here. They all do some really cool stuff, and Bloomburrow was a great set to get new frogs. So just to dive into some of the creatures a little bit, some of the obvious frogs that I run are Spore Frog, Urg, Spawn of Turg, which Urg really goes well in this deck with if I use Glarb Surveil. Its power is equal to the number of lands in my graveyard. If I'm putting lands into my graveyard, that's just going to make Urg bigger. I also really like the card Clifftop Lookout. This is another Bloomburrow card, and it's a 1/2 with reach, and it says when Clifftop Lookout enters, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. Put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then the rest on the bottom in a random order. This is really powerful because it's not just basic land, so it can get any land on the top, and because I'm playing Glarb and I can look at the top of my library, and with Glarb Surveil, I have the ability to somewhat manipulate the top of my library. I can really stack it if I have a land on there that I really want to get onto the battlefield, cast the Clifftop Lookout, and boom, it's just there. I also have some minor like blink and bounce effects that give me some advantage. So I run Lily Splash Mentor, which is a 4/4 frog druid with reach, and for 1 and 1 green and 1 blue I can exile a target creature I control and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Now you can only do that at sorcery speed, but that's nice with Glarb because I could put a +1/+1 counter on him, make him bigger. Also, if I've used him for the Surveil, I can just pay to exile him and then bring him back and he'll enter untapped. And then I also run Lightning Greaves in the deck, so if I can give him haste, I can tap him and do that whole thing again. Also, Valley Mightcaller is another card that I really like. So Valley Mightcaller, it's a 1/1 frog warrior, and it has trample and says whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel I control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Because I am trying to get frogs out onto the battlefield, even though that's not like the main theme. I wouldn't call this frog tribal necessarily. Valley Mightcaller actually does end up getting to be pretty large in certain situations. Another really cool card from Bloomburrow is Clement, the Worrywart. It's a 3/3 frog druid with vigilance, and this is whenever he or another creature I control enters, return up to 1 target creature I control with lesser mana value to its owner's hand. And then frogs I control have tap, add a green or a blue, but you can only use that mana to cast creature spells. Clement actually ends up doing a pretty decent amount for this deck once I get frogs onto the battlefield. Having the ability to bounce stuff back to my hand works well again with Glarb, because if I bounce Glarb back to my hand after I've used it for the Surveil, if I have the mana, I can play Glarb again. So the frogs actually work really well with one another, which is really, really cool to see. Probably the best frog in the deck that isn't Glarb might be Psychic Frog. So Psychic Frog is a 1/2 frog, and it says whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, I draw a card. I can discard a card to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then I can exile 3 cards from my graveyard, and it gains flying until end of turn. A 2-drop frog that draws you cards when it deals combat damage is going to be really, really powerful for this deck, because there's many times I've played this deck where I've been able to get him out on turn 2, turn 3, hit at least one of the players at the table, draw a card. It's giving me advantage. And then, because I play out of the graveyard a little bit, being able to discard pitch cards into my graveyard to make Psychic Frog bigger is actually really advantageous. Another really good card in the deck, and this card has actually seen a price spike because of Bloomburrow, it's Omnibian. So Omnibian is 1, 2 green, and 1 blue for a frog, and it's a 3/3, and you can just tap it to turn a creature into a 3/3 frog. As one of the lands in the deck, I also run the 3-Tree City from Bloomburrow, which I have done this in a game before, tap Omnibian to make a non-frog that I have into a frog, and then 3 Tree City taps for an additional mana because I have another frog on the battlefield. So Omnibian's cool. It can also just power down my opponent's creatures if somebody's swinging at me with an Apex Devastator or an Ulamog or something like that. I can just turn it into a 3/3 frog, and it still has all its abilities and everything. Omnibian doesn't remove any abilities, but instead of taking a whole bunch of damage, I'm only going to take 3 damage. So Omnibian's really cool for that. And then one of the more powerful creatures in the deck is Lord of Extinction. So it's an elemental, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in all graveyards. So it works really well if I have opponents that are playing graveyard decks, but because of the Surveil with Glarb, I'm able to actually put cards into my graveyard to build up Lord of Extinction's power, which this is one of the ways that I will kill people in the deck, is by playing Lord of Extinction towards the end of the game when graveyards are really full, and he's just a 50-50. In the game, I actually have Lord of Extinction on the battlefield, and at one point I think it became like a 130 something or a 140 something. Really, really big, really strong creature. Those were the main creatures that I wanted to highlight. You can check the deck list on MTG Goldfish, and you can see all the creatures that I'm running. But one of the main things that I said earlier with the deck is I want to be able to play as many lands as I can. We're going to run Explorations and Burgeonings, and then we're going to run Azusa, Lost But Seeking, to be able to play additional lands. Being able to put lands onto the battlefield is not only going to enable me to put more frogs or more creatures onto the battlefield, but it's going to help me build for those game-ending plays and those game-ending spells. So to talk about that a little bit, the main 2 spells that I have in this deck that are going to help me end games are going to be Finale of Devastation and Villainous Wealth. Villainous Wealth is nice because if I get into a situation where it's like me and one other player, I can cast the Villainous Wealth and just exile cards from their library and then play as much as I can. And if I've put a lot of mana into the Villainous Wealth, I basically can cast whatever I want. Anything I don't want to cast, it's going to stay exiled. So not only am I getting resources from my opponent, I'm eliminating the possibility of my opponent having those resources at a later point in the game. Finale of Devastation is really great because I can, if I don't have Lord of Extinction on the battlefield, I can pull Lord of Extinction out onto the battlefield from my library, give him a huge buff, give all my creatures a huge buff, give them all haste, and then I'm able to swing people out. Another card that really goes well with is another frog. It's the Rampant Frogantua. It's a 3/3 with trample, 2 and a green, and it says it gets +10/+10 for each player who has lost the game, and then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, I may mill that many cards, and then I put any number of lands that were milled that way onto the battlefield tapped. Finale of Devastation with Rampant Frogantua and the Lord of Extinction, they're going to be really, really helpful to finish and close out games. I do run a lot of, staple cards in these colors, Rhystic Study, Psych Rift, that type of stuff. One interaction that I found out about in game that I didn't actually think about when I was building the deck was the interaction between Fortune Teller's Talent and Sensei's Divining Top. So Fortune Teller's Talent is an enchantment that you level up, and it's for 1 blue. It says you may look at the top card of your library at any time. Already, I love this card. Looking at the top is my favorite thing to do. Being able to do that for 1 blue mana, it's beautiful. Then you could pay 3 to blue to level it up to level 2, and as long as you cast a spell this turn, you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. Really cool. I get to do something like that with Glarb, but with Fortune Teller's Talent, I don't have the mana restriction of the spells having to be 4 or greater in order to play them. But then that third ability, the third level, that's where it really starts to go crazy with Sensei's Divining Top. The third level is spells you cast from anywhere other than your hand cost 2 less to cast. So Sensei's Divining Top is 1 mana, and then you tap it to draw a card and put it on top. So as long as I've cast a spell, I can play Sensei's Divining Top from the top of my library and draw all the cards in my deck if I want to. Which, if I have the right setup, that's going to be really advantageous, because I can just pull all the cards into my hand and I have all the mana that I need, so I can just, play all the spells that I need to in order to close out that game. Really, really cool interaction between these 2 cards. It's not something that I thought about when I was building the deck, and it was actually really fun to come to that realization that that's how that worked in game. A couple of lands that I want to highlight. Number 1, I already talked about it a little bit, is 3 Tree City. In this deck, 3 Tree City actually can do a lot for me. If I get a lot of frogs onto the battlefield, I'm able to tap it for a bunch of mana. I also run the Urborg Cabal Coffers combo in this deck, so I make a bunch of black mana with those 2, and then I'm able to use that 2 of that black mana to activate the 3-tree city. But then another one that I want to highlight is Minamo School at Water's Edge. This is a really powerful land in this deck because it allows me to either untap Glarb and use him again, or I can actually untap the 3-tree city and use it to get more mana, which I have done before. I have done several times. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about with this deck is ways that this deck actually can protect itself. I do run a few counter spells in the deck. Force of Negation is a card that I run in this deck as well. Outside of those counter spells, ways that I have to protect myself is more of like turning my opponent's stuff into frogs, really. So I run cards like Polymorphous Jess and Turn to Frog, and I talked about Omnibian earlier. Polymorphous Jess is the board wipe, so to speak, version of Turn to Frog. Turn to Frog, turn a target creature into a 1/1 frog and it loses all abilities. Polymorphous Jess is where I target an opponent and all of their creatures become 1/1 frogs and have no abilities. So in the game, in the second game that we played, you saw where I used the Polymorphous Jess to turn Steven's creatures into 1/1 frogs with no abilities to prevent his infinite combo from going off. That is honestly one of my favorite ways to interact with players in this deck. Rapid Hybridization is another one where I destroy a creature. You know, it's like Beast Within. Instead of giving a 3/3 beast, they get a 3/3 frog lizard. That's just one of the fun ways that I have to interact with the deck, is just turning my opponent's stuff into frogs, and it's really cool. This deck is actually quite powerful, and I really am happy with the design of Glarb. As soon as I saw it, I was like, this is a deck that I wanted to build. You know, I don't have my Tatiova deck anymore. I took that apart and basically used some of the pieces for Glarb, and the last Sultai deck that I had was the Hydra Zaxara, and I just have so much more fun when I'm playing Glarb than when I played Zaxara. So really happy that this card was created, and I'm really excited to keep playing this deck and all the fun interactive stuff that this deck can do, and just swing people out with really big frogs, man. Let me know down in the comments if you have any other questions about this deck, or if you have any suggestions on maybe making it a little bit better, or some fun cards that you got from Bloomburrow that you think would be good additions to this deck. But you could also just let me know down in the comments what your favorite cards from Bloomburrow are. Don't forget to check out more of our content, check out our gameplay series, our podcast, and thanks so much for watching. You guys have a good one.